Hey, happy Saturday, everybody. Happy Saturday. Welcome back to 24th Street Theater and welcome back to our Saturday Explorer series.
Hola, ¿cómo están? Bienvenidos otra vez a nuestra serie de exploradores de los sábados del Teatro 24.
That is our Associate Artistic Director, Chima Castaños.
Gracias. Dave McAdams, director ejecutivo del Teatro 24.
And proud to be. And this is our colleague and ASL interpreter all the way from New York today, Deanna Paff. Hey, Deanna, how are you?
Deanna.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Speaking of sound, it has been 14 months since we've really heard any sound, especially any applause or any laughter in this room. So I love that sound.
I love the applause too, Jay. Even though we know it is not real, it feels good to have it. And this is only because we have Brad, our musician, here with us.
Hey, good afternoon, guys. How are you doing?
You know, it makes sense that the musician is providing the applause because, Brad, it is music to my ears. Keep it coming.
I'll do it. I'll help however I can.
And hey, thanks for keeping it alive in the Zoom where it happens.
Zoom. Zoom. Zoom.
For you Hamilton fans out there. But hey, listen, one thing we know for sure. We cannot replace you with sound effects. It's not even close to the real deal. And very soon, we know that you will be back here in the room with us. Look at us, we're maskless. It's happening, the reopening is happening. But in the meantime, until everything's completely reopened, we really do appreciate you being online with us.
We started this program in 1998. Yes, last century, believe it or not. And so far, we have done almost 100 shows of different disciplines like theater, dance, puppetry, poetry, music, multimedia, you name it. Shows from all over the planet. As a matter of fact, this year, we are having stories from 4 different continents. The last 2 weeks, we have stories from Africa and America. And this week, today, we are having stories from Europe. And next week, we're going to end up with stories all the way from Asia. I don't think we can be more international than that, Jay.
That's right. And the reason we chose storytelling for this year is, well, number one, the year we've all just had. And also that stories build empathy, right?
Absolutely,
And we
yes.
thought with the year we've all had, it's a natural way to get back to our Explorer series.
Yeah, especially from, what we went through last year and until now.
Right. And to kick us off, we have our friend Bennett Schneider. Bennett has performed before in our Explorer series, so he's an Explorer veteran. He is a fabulous writer. He's a comedian. He's a visual artist as well. He does a great number of things.
Jay, don't make us wait anymore. Let's bring him in.
Bennett Schneider, everybody. Hey, Bennett, how are you?
Hi, Jay. Hi, Chima. Nice to see you.
Hey,
Happy Saturday.
how are you? Hey, Bennett,
I'm
where are
very
you
good.
performing from? Are you in town?
I am performing from the magical land of Koreatown, Los Angeles.
That's great.
Which means he's about 4 miles to the north of us.
Exactly right.
In the theater. Hey, Bennett, week 1 of our series, we had Anansi tales, so classic traditional tales that Al Bostic brought us. And then we went to stories from the Americas, which were different. They were family stories that had been handed down. You kind of bridged that because you've got classic tales known all over the world, but in your case, they came from family, right? Handed down.
Yes, that's absolutely right. A lot of people may be familiar with at least one of the stories I'll tell. And I wasn't sure what stories to tell, but watching the stories they were specifically from Mexico, and the storyteller talked about how his abuelo, his grandfather, had told him these stories, and that's why they had a lot of meaning and resonance for him. I was really moved by that. My mom passed away a year and 2 months ago, and so hearing him talk about his abuelo with such love, it inspired me. Immediately I knew, my mom is the person who gave me stories. She always bought me my favorite books from a childhood through adulthood. She bought me the best books. She just had unerring taste in stories. And so I thought, I'm going to tell a story from one of my mom's books. Let me show you. When I was 8 years old, I was at my grandmother's house, and I went into this little shed she had behind her house, and there were these boxes of books, and they had been my mom's books when she was a child. And I found these two books that were published in the 1930s when my mom was a little girl. And I brought them into the house and I started to read them because they're filled with fairy tales. And my mom and my grandmother saw me, and they so loved that I loved the stories that she had loved. So they gave me these books, and I've kept them all my life. I grew up in Maine, all the way across the country. I brought them 3,000 miles with me so I could have them here in Los Angeles. So today I'm going to tell you a story from Grimm's fairy tales. It's called The Frog Prince, and you might know it, but there's a special ending to it that's very moving. So I'm going to tell that one from my mother's book. And I'm going to tell a story from Oscar Wilde's fairy tales. He was an Irish and English poet and playwright, and he wrote just heart-achingly beautiful fairy tales. And so I'm going to tell you one of his.
Oh, I can't wait. Bennett, it is always a pleasure to watch you to perform. I'm very excited.
Thank you, Judge.
And listen, can you stick around for just a few minutes after your performance? Because I know our audience is going to have a couple of questions for you.
That sounds like fun.
Fabulous.
Is everybody ready? ¿Estamos listos? Disfruten del maravilloso arte del cuentacuentos. Enjoy the beautiful art of storytelling. Con ustedes, Bennett Schneider.
Assalamu alaikum. Hola. Hello. Namaste. The first story is by the brothers Grimm. It is told in Germany and France for hundreds of years, and now I will tell it to you. And as it should, it begins with, once upon a time. There was a gorgeous castle, and in this castle lived a king and a queen, and they had a daughter, a princess. She was their only child, and they loved her so much they gave her everything she wanted. All of her toys were gold. Her favorite toy was a round golden ball, perfectly round, and the gold shone, and she would throw it in the air and catch it, and the gold would catch the sunlight and glint like stars. She would wander around the gardens of the castle, tossing it and catching it and tossing it and catching it. And one day she went all through the gardens, past the peonies and past the roses, and Lord knows past the lilacs. And she came to the lily pond at the edge of the garden. And the lily pond had beautiful lilies sprouting from the lily pads all across the surface of the pond. And frogs liked to sit on the lily pads and catch flies. But the rest of the pond was kind of muddy and dirty. It was a pond. Well, she was tossing her ball high in the air right at the edge of the pond, and wouldn't you know it, it went a little off and landed in the pond. Bloop. Well, she was absolutely heartbroken. It was her favorite toy, and it just went in the pond. And the pond was filled with mud and scum and algae, and she couldn't go and get it because she was wearing that new gown, the pink chiffon gown with the chiffon that luffs in the wind when you walk. That was not going to get algae on it. So she plopped down on the bank and she cried her heart out, which is what princesses in fairy tales often do to get something they want. She wept and she wept. My golden ball! Where is my golden ball? It is in the depths of the pond. And just then, one of the frogs heard her weeping, and he climbed up out of the muck, and he sat on the grass next to her, and he looked up at her and said, I say, Ribbit, your little golden ball's gone and plopped into the pond, has it? Well, I'll tell you what. I'm an amphibious creature. That means I can breathe underwater. I'm a frog, don't you know, and I will go, and I will fetch your golden ball in exchange for something from you. Well, the princess looked at the frog. It was her first experience with a talking frog. I don't know if you've met many talking frogs. I've met only 3 in my life. And she had never met one. So she looked at it and she said, okay, talking frog, I'll give you, I'll invite you to dinner at the castle. 1 free dinner at the castle. And the frog said, well, if you're going to be there, then that's a deal. All right, you just wait here. Don't ruffle your pretty little chiffon gown. I'll be right back with your golden ball. And he jumped into the pond. And the princess didn't even have a minute to sob before he had reappeared, pushing the golden ball up the embankment of the pond, and he rolled it right beside her. And just as he was about to say, well, there you are, she grabbed the ball, popped up, and ran back to the castle as fast as she could to get away from the slimy frog. She slammed the castle door and went straight up to her bedroom to disinfect everything. Later that evening, she sat down to dinner with her father, the king, and her mother, the queen. And she told them of her day, and I nearly lost my golden ball, but I got it back because I'm a princess, and that's what we do. And suddenly there was a loud knock on the castle door. The doorbell wiring needs to be fixed. The door was opened by the king's valet, and he looked around to see what knight or nobleman might be there, but there was no one there. He couldn't see a thing. And then he heard, "Hello, yo, I'm mighty down here. I'm a frog." And he looked down, and there was the frog. And the frog hopped into the castle. And he hopped up the stone spiral staircase to the dining room. And he hopped into the dining room. And he hopped into the chair covered in burgundy velvet right next to the princess. Thump. The princess squealed. "There's a frog at the dinner table. Take it away. Take it away. It's slimy." But the frog spoke and said, to the amazement of the king, "Hey, here now, wait a minute, pretty. You promised me one meal at the castle if I got you your golden ball back. And I do believe you got your golden ball back. So that's a dinner for Mr. Frog. That's me." The king looked at his daughter and he said, "Ermentrude," because that was her name. She never called herself Ermentrude. She didn't like the name, but her name was Ermentrude. "Ermentrude, is it true that you have promised this frog one dinner at the castle? We must never lie, Ermentrude." And the princess looked at her father, whom she loved, and she said, "Yes, father, I did promise the frog a dinner at the castle." The king clapped his hands, and beside her plate of rugula espinaca, they brought the frog his own plate of flies espinaca with cream sauce. The frog ate them all up, and the princess, she ate her espinaca really quickly and popped up from the dinner table, wiping her mouth and saying, "Mother and father, excuse me, I'm very tired. Thank you so much for dinner." And she peeled off and ran up the stairs to her bedroom, where she slammed the door and locked it, finally away from the frog. She thought that was it. But she soon heard noises coming up the steps. Thwip, thwap, thwip, thwap, thwip, thwap, thwap. And then there was a knock on her bedroom door. It was thick wood, so it took longer for the sound to travel. Well, she knew it was the frog, and she said, "Go away! You got your dinner! Go away!" And the frog said, Now, let's not be temperamental. Gotta be a good host if you're a princess." And he slithered under her door, which was just enough of a crack to let him in. And he hopped over to her bed where she was sitting. And she was so over the frog at this point that she picked him up by one of his webbed feet and she threw him at the wall. Now, I just want to tell you something about this story. You are probably waiting for the princess to kiss the frog. Now, a lot of people tell the story that way, but I don't. I'm going with my mother's book and the old German tradition. And in that tradition, she doesn't kiss him. She throws him at the wall. So she threw the frog at the wall, and he hit the wall with a thwack, and he slid down the wall. But here's the thing. When his body hit the stone wall, it broke a curse, and the frog turned into a beautifully dressed, very handsome prince. The prince stood up and he said, "Your Royal Highness, my lovely princess, thank you. You have broken the curse that was put on me by a terrible witch back in the forests of my own kingdom. And that's why I pursued you, because I knew that you had the power of a true princess's pure heart, and that you could free me from this curse. And as they looked at each other, they fell in love, because this is a fairy tale, and that's how fast that happens. They went and they clasped hands, and he told her his name, Beauregard. Ermentrude, Beauregard, Ermentrude, Beauregard. And holding hands, they went down to introduce Beauregard to the king and queen. And just then, Beauregard's carriage had arrived from his own kingdom, and it rolled up to the front door of Ermentrude's palace. And they went down, and they went and got into the golden carriage to ride off to Beauregard's kingdom, where they were going to be husband and wife and rule with peace and love and happiness. And as the carriage started to roll away, Ermentrude heard a loud crack, pang! He thought, oh no, one of the wheels of the carriage is broken. Stop the carriage, there's a wheel off. And Beauregard leaned out the window. He said, Henry! Henry was his personal valet who was driving the carriage. Henry, one of the wheels is breaking. And Henry, Prince Beauregard's beloved valet, looked down and said to the prince and princess, don't worry, it's not the wheels, it's my heart. When the curse was placed on you by the witch, my heart was breaking, so I had the ironsmith make bands of iron to put around my heart to keep it from breaking. And now you are well again, and my heart is so glad that you're back, that it is swelling with happiness, and as it swells, it's breaking the iron bands. That's what you're hearing. And so they rolled on to Beauregard's kingdom. Pang, crack of Henry's heart all the way. And there, in Beauregard's kingdom, they lived happily ever after. I hope you liked that one. Now I'm going to go about 200-300 years forward in time, to the time of Oscar Wilde. And he wrote these fairy tales as a way of talking about what was going on in the world around him in his day and time, both politics and morality, what he thought of how people were treating other people. He wrote these fairy tales to talk about that and teach lessons that were close to his heart. In this story, there are going to be 3 dreams. Have you ever had a dream that changed your mind or changed your feelings about something, or even maybe changed your life? That's the kind of dreams these are going to be. So be sure you listen and watch for the 3 dreams coming. Oscar Wilde's story, The Young King. Once upon a time, there was a kingdom that was surrounded with trees and fields. And in the middle of the kingdom, there was a castle. And on this day, in that castle, there was a 16-year-old boy, the prince, and he was reclining on his sofa covered in pink velvet. He kept feeling the velvet. He'd never felt velvet before. And he kept looking around in amazement at the gold things in the castle, and the diamonds and the sapphires and the emeralds and the paintings by famous artists and the tapestries woven by nuns in a convent in the mountains. He was amazed at all of this luxury because he had never been in a castle before. In fact, only 3 days before, this prince wasn't a prince. He was a shepherd tending sheep in a field at the edge of the kingdom. How did the shepherd get to the castle and become a prince? I will tell you now. Let's go back in time, 16 years ago. There was a king in that castle, the old king, and he had a beautiful daughter. And that daughter had met and fallen in love with a foreign man. Even though the king, her father, said, "You must never speak to that foreign man. I forbid it." But she spoke to him a lot, and they fell in love. And they ran away to get away from her father. And they hid, and they lived together in love, and they got married, and they had a beautiful baby boy. But the king was hard-hearted, And he searched and he found his daughter, the princess, and he had his knights pull her back to the castle. And no one ever saw the foreign man again. And he locked the princess, his daughter, in a tower room. And he even took away her baby boy. And eventually she died of a broken heart. The king told his knights, take this baby boy and bring him out to the edge of the kingdom. Find a shepherd and tell the shepherd to raise this boy as his own. But tell the shepherd he must never tell the boy that he is a prince. He must never say that he is my grandson. He should grow up believing he is a shepherd. And that is what happened. 16 years later, the old king was old and close to his death. And on his deathbed, he regretted the bad things he had done. And he called in his advisors and he said to them, I am sorry for the trouble and the pain that I've caused in my life. Go, send the knights to find my grandson, the prince. He believes he's a shepherd. He lives probably on the edge of the kingdom looking after sheep. Go and tell him he is not a shepherd, he's a prince, and bring him to the castle. Crown him that he may be king after me and rule the kingdom. And with that, the old king died. And the knights went out, and they went to the edge of the kingdom, and they found the shepherd boy, and they told him, to his great amazement, that he was, in fact, the prince. And they brought him to the castle. They took off his shepherd clothes, and they gave him fine silks to wear. And ever since then, the boy, the prince, was just amazed and stunned at the luxury of the castle, the diamonds, the sapphires, the emeralds. So when they asked him, my lord, what do you wish to wear for your coronation? He replied, Oh, give me long flowing robes made from solid gold thread. Yes, and I want a crown that's encrusted with red rubies. Oh, and that scepter, the thing that symbolizes my authority. Cover it in moon-like pearls that shine. So this night, as he reclined on his pink velvet sofa, he slipped away into sleep, thinking about the gold robes and the ruby crown and the pearl-crusted scepter. And he started to dream 3 dreams. In the first dream, he found himself in a factory. It was a dark, dirty, dingy factory. And right before him was an enormous loom. A loom is a machine that you pass threads through and weave cloth to make clothing. And seated at this loom, working very hard, was an old man. And he was very poor. You could tell because his clothes were rags and they had holes in them. And you could see his bones because there was no muscle to fill out the skin, just skin and bones. He'd lost his hair, lost his teeth, and his eyes were sunken into his head. He looked up at the prince and he was surprised. And he spoke. He said, Oh, do you have some tin coins? They pay me only 10 coins, and they never pay me enough. I'm not a slave, but I might as well be one for how little they pay me. I sit here and I weave emerald silk and magenta silk, and the silk goes to make the clothes of rich people like my master who owns the factory. He rides the city on a fat white horse wearing the magenta silk that I make. But for all his gold, do you think he gives me any dough? No, only thin tin coins. Do you have a few for me so I can buy a potato skin for dinner? I'm very hungry. The prince asked the old man, What are you making clothes for now? And the old man said, This will be my greatest work. I'm weaving gold thread to make golden robes for the young king's coronation. The prince awoke immediately from the dream, and he was absolutely disturbed to know where his golden robes were being made and how. He was very upset, but he looked out the window and he saw the moon in the sky shining in silver light. And there was a nightingale sitting on a vine just at the side of his window, singing a calm song. And the song of the nightingale calmed the prince down, and he went back to sleep. And then he dreamed the second dream. In this dream, he was on the ocean on a boat. And at the front of the boat, there were a crowd of young boys his age. And they were all kneeling down, crouched down on the deck. And none of them was wearing any clothes at all, except a thin strip of cotton around their waist. On the boat also, there was a cruel master. He had a big headdress and he held a whip. And he would point at one of the boys and point at the water and say, "Dive!" The boy would get up trembling and go to the side of the boat and slip over the side of the boat into the water. Well, he stayed down there a long time. I don't know how long you can hold your breath, but the prince thought, is he ever going to come up? Is he drowned? Finally, the boy broke the surface of the water and he held his arm up with an oyster in his hand. If you don't know, an oyster, it's a clam with a very rough shell. Oysters live on the bottom of the ocean. And when a sand grain gets inside their shell, it irritates them, it itches. So they cover the sand with some shell. And the shell they cover it with is white and shiny. And this is how pearls get made. So the master reached down and he took the oyster from the boy's hand and he took a sharp knife and he opened it and there was the pearl. And he looked at it, but it had a little bump on one side, so he threw the pearl into the water and he shouted at the boy, "Dive again!" The boy went down for longer this time. The prince thought for sure he had drowned. But no, he broke the surface of the water again and held up another oyster. And the master grabbed it and opened it and took out a perfectly round pearl, shining like the moon. The master put the pearl into a pouch on his side and shouted at the boy, "Dive again!" The boy went down and up 3 more times. And on the 4th time, the boy did not come back up. Not after 5 minutes, not after 10, not after 15 minutes. And the master pointed to the next boy on the deck of the ship and said, "You, dive!" The prince was very scared. And he went to the master and he said, "What are these pearls for?" And the master said to the prince, "Oh, we only have 4 perfect pearls, and I need 100 more. These must cover the scepter of the young king on his coronation." The prince awoke again, very upset. He was completely disturbed by this horrible dream to know where the pearls were coming from. But he looked out the window and he saw the moon had risen higher in the sky. So the moonlight came in the window and fell onto his bed. And there was the nightingale on the vines by the side of the window, perched and singing like little silver bells ringing, and it calmed him, and he fell back asleep. And he had the 3rd dream. In this dream, he was on a low hill, and before him was a large patch of dirt, and there was another low hill with a hole in the side. This was a mine, and there were thousands of men and boys marching into the hole in the opposite hill, marching down into the mine to go and bring up the minerals of the earth. And standing next to him on his hill were 2 spirits. One was death, and one was greed. And death turned to greed, and death said to greed, "Greed, give me half of the men here, just half. You'll have enough to finish your mining." And greed said, "Who do you think I am? I am greed. You're not even going to get 1/4 of my men." And death said, "Very well." And he took out a black stone from his robes, and he threw it over the heads of the boys and the men. And in the middle of the air, the black stone transformed into the spirit of plague. And sickness fell over half the men and boys, and they dropped dead. Death laughed and scooped up the souls of the dead men and boys. And he turned back to Greed and he said, Greed, give me just 1/4 of the men and boys left. Just 1/4 and I'll go away. And Greed said, have you not heard me? Did I not just tell you who I am? I'm Greed, and you will not even get 1 of my men. And Death said, very well. And he took from his pocket a red stone and he threw it out over the head of the men and boys. And not 1/4 of them, but half of them were affected by the new spirit that came out of the stone, the spirit of war. And War took an iron sword and he cut down half of all the men and boys left. And they dropped, bleeding and dead. Death turned to Greed and he said, one last time, give me only 1 of these men, and I will go away and leave you in peace. But Greed turned to Death, and with flaming green eyes and wild green hair, he said, you will not even get 1 fingernail clipping from my men. Mine, mine, mine! Death said, that's fine. And he took out a gray stone, and he threw it over the head of the men and boys that were left. And in the middle of the air, the stone transformed into the spirit of hunger. And all the men and boys that were left grabbed their stomachs, bent over, and dropped down dead. The prince was crying. He was so sad. He went down the hill and walked among the dead, and he found 1 person left alive. It was the manager of the mine, the foreman. And he said to the foreman of the mine, what were they here to dig out of the earth? And the foreman looked at the prince and said, I don't know what we're going to do now. We'll never get enough. They were here to dig out 500 red rubies for the crown of the young king's coronation. The prince awoke from his dream immediately, and he was weeping. His clothes were stained with his tears. He was so distraught to know where the rubies were coming from. But he looked out the window. He looked for the moon, but it wasn't there. Instead, he saw the sun just coming up from the horizon. And the nightingale had left the vine. Just then, his door opened, and into his bedchamber came his favorite little page, the one with the curly hair and the skinny legs and the skinny arms, only 12 years old. And the page, dressed in his little powder blue silk robes, was carrying in his arms the golden robes for the young king's coronation. And he said to the prince, good morning, your majesty. I have come to help you put on your beautiful golden robes. But the prince said to his page, no, I cannot. I will not. It is impossible for me to wear this. I will not wear it. Page, bring me my shepherd's staff of wood, my sheepskin vest, my cotton pants, and my little leather shoes. These are what I will wear. The page was very confused, but he did as he was told, and he brought the robes away, and he went and found the shepherd's clothing and the wooden staff, and he brought them to the prince and helped him put them on. And he said, well, I see your robes and I see your scepter of wood, but I don't see a crown. So the prince reached out to his window and he pulled out some of the vines that the nightingale had sang on, and he wove them into a little circle that he wore around his brow. He said, there, now I am ready to be coronated. And the page nervously followed him as he went out of his bedchamber. Well, outside, in the hallway outside his bedchamber, were all the nobles of the kingdom, the dukes and the barons and the earls, mustn't forget the earls, and they bowed low, and as they looked up, they saw what the prince was wearing. And they started to laugh, and they thought, oh, this is such a good joke. Our new king has got a sense of humor. He's dressing in rags for his coronation. Hilarious. The prince said, no, I am wearing this before my people. And the nobles were confused for a minute. And they begged him to go back into his room and to put on the golden robes, the robes of a king. And the prince refused, and the nobles became angry. The prince walked out of the castle with the nobles following, wagging their fingers and scolding him. "Go back this instant! You are a king! You must wear gold!" And outside the castle, there was a beautiful, ornate golden carriage to carry him off to the cathedral. But he turned and borrowed the horse from a guard and rode that instead. And he rode through the streets of the city. And all the people of the kingdom had come to see the young king be coronated. And they crowded in the streets along the route. And they saw the nobles chasing after him, wagging their fingers. And they thought, well, this person in beggar's clothing, in shepherd's clothing, he must be the young king. But, oh no, the young king's a fool. And they started to point at him and laugh, saying, "The king is an idiot! He's dressed in rags!" Some of them even threw food, like tomatoes and cabbage, at the young king, but he paid it no mind. And he rode straight to the cathedral, the lords and ladies chasing after him the whole way. He went into the cathedral, up the steps, and he went up to the altar where the bishop stood. And the bishop looked confused at this shepherd, and he said, "I'm sorry, who are you?" And the boy said, "I have come for my coronation." And the bishop, realizing that this must be the young king, he'd heard the story about being a shepherd, he said, "My lord, please, I cannot coronate you in this. Please go into the vestry and put on the golden robes of a king, and then we shall have a coronation." And the young king, the young prince, told him about the 3 dreams and why he could not wear the golden robes and the ruby crown and the pearl scepter. The bishop was a man of God, and he understood, but he said this. He said, "My lord, it is time to put away the pain of others. We cannot carry the suffering of other people, especially on a day that was made for glory, the glory of a king." And the prince looked the bishop in the eye and he said, "You dare say that in this house?" And he looked at the cross above the altar, and he went to it and he knelt down and he began to pray. Just then, the knights of the kingdom, with their shining armor, all ready for a coronation, they burst into the cathedral. They ran up to the altar with their swords drawn. They were ready to run through this imposter with their swords. "Who dares mock our kingdom? What fool dresses like a beggar when he should be our king?" Just as they were about to strike, the young prince stood up and turned around. And at this moment, outside the cathedral, the sun broke through the clouds, and its bright rays shone down through the stained glass window of the cathedral. And the colored light from the window shone down on the young prince, and the colors swirled around him, and they rose a robe of rainbow colors that he wore shining. And at that moment, the vines around his head burst into red roses, full and redder than any ruby. And his wooden shepherd's staff burst into blooms of white lilies, whiter than any pearl. All the lords and the knights and the bishop were amazed, and they bowed and knelt on one knee. The knights offered their swords to the young king in fealty, and the bishop, standing up, said, "I cannot perform your coronation, my lord. Someone far greater than I hath crowned thee already." And as long as the young king reigned, and it was a long time, and he reigned very wisely, as long as he reigned, no one in his kingdom went hungry, and no one suffered. In fact, they all lived happily ever after. That was my mom.
Bravo, Bennett.
Thank you, Jay.
Bravo, Bennett. Always,
That was pretty good, man.
always so great to watch you work.
Thank you, Jay. Thank you.
And you know, I always feel like I need a nap after I watch you work.
That's because I've spiked your teeth.
All right, I know some people in the audience have some questions, so there's a couple of ways that you can ask questions. You can type it in the chat, and our Zoom stage manager, Brittany. Hey, Brittany, are you here? There she is. We'll read your question in the chat, or you can raise your hand, either your hand emoji or your real hand, and stage manager Brittany will put you on the screen and unmute you, and you can ask Bennett directly. All right? So go ahead and be typing your questions in the chat or raising your hand. And in the meantime, Bennett, I have a question for you, which is, what was the common denominator when you chose these two stories, very different types of stories? What was the common denominator in both of them?
Well, usually I tell stories. I'm a very silly person. My father was a clown on
attest to
television
that.
when I was a kid, and I inherited his silliness. So usually I tell stories like Grimm's fairy tales, and I'm very silly. But I was so moved by the tales from Mexico, and I talked with Debbie, who works at 24th Street Theater, as a brilliant director, and we really wanted to go for something that was really heartfelt. And I thought immediately of Oscar Wilde and how his stories just go right into your heart. So that was the first one we picked because of that. And the first one that I brought in and said, hey, I think this one would be good. And then because we picked that one, I picked The Frog Prince because of that ending, because of the story of Henry, the prince's valet, and how he put the bands around his heart, and how when his heart was glad and it was swelling with happiness, they broke the iron bands. I have always remembered that detail. For me, it was the first time when I was a little kid, when I was reading something and I could imagine what love felt like. I recognized that pang feeling, and I was like, yeah. It was the first time I'd ever read someone writing and describing that feeling of love. And I thought, you never hear that when you hear The Frog Prince. So I wanted to do that one.
That is beautiful and interesting. And before I get to Brittany, just tell me the name of the second story, answering Ariana Lopez.
It's called The Young King by Oscar Wilde.
The Young King.
The Young King.
Britt, what questions do we have?
Yes, we have Margaret in the audience. Margaret, I've enabled you to turn on your video and unmute so you can talk to us. Hi.
Hi, Margaret.
Margaret, where are you today, Margaret? Are you in Los Angeles?
Yes.
Good.
Hi, neighbor.
What's your question for Bennett?
It's about the first story about the princess and the toys. How would she be able to lift gold if gold is pretty heavy?
You are so smart. I was just thinking about how heavy gold is this morning. I was thinking of the other story and the king's scepter being gold, and how Queen Elizabeth in England has a gold scepter. And I was like, how does she lift it? Here's what I think with the golden ball. The golden ball, maybe not solid gold. It might be gold plated, and I bet it's hollow inside. So it's not solid all the way through.
So like it came from the shopping network or something.
A very expensive shop. It came from the Beverly Hills Hotel gift store.
It's so funny because I just saw, the real life queen that Bennett's talking about, the Queen of England. I just saw last week she was doing an event and she had on a hat because she's known for hats. And it was a big fancy event that she normally would wear her crown for, but she's very old and she said, it's too heavy. It weighs 2 pounds. It's hard. I'm just going to wear the hat. So you're right. Gold is heavy. Very, very, very smart of you. And I love your ears.
It's an interesting question for you, Margaret. You don't have to answer now. It makes me think, what is the heaviest metal? Is it gold? Is it iron? Or is it lead? Or is it something else? I think it's gold, but that's a question. I'm going to Google that later.
All right. Thank you, Miss Unicorn, for that question. It was a great one.
Yes,
What else you got? What else you got, Brittany?
We also have Henry. Henry, I'm going to bring you on in one moment. All right, Henry, you can turn on your video and unmute so you can ask your question to Bennett.
When you see me look down, it's because my computer's down there, so I can see your face if I look down.
We thought you were admiring your feet.
Well, I'm not wearing shoes today. I tell stories better when I don't wear shoes.
Uh-huh.
Hey, Henry, thank you for being with us.
Hi, Henry.
What's your question?
Do you think the prince went back to his foreign father and helped him?
I'm very sure that very quickly he went and found the guy, the shepherd who raised him. I'm very sure that he went and found him immediately. I think he probably brought him to the feast, the coronation feast, when they went back to the castle and they had all kinds of beautiful food. He probably had a knight go immediately and bring his shepherd father and probably sat right next to him at the head of the table.
A great question, Henry. How old are you?
I'm 10.
And Henry, have you ever heard either of these stories before? Did you say no, you hadn't? First time? Great. That's a great, great question.
I'll go you one further. I bet going forward that the young king didn't wear silk robes, like he wanted to be a little more humble. I bet he got his shepherd father. He got all the wool of his sheep, and he wore wool clothes made from the sheep that his father raised on his farm.
Wow.
Wow.
Henry, great question. Thanks for joining us today. Did you enjoy it? Did you like the stories? That's great. Thanks for joining us, buddy.
I think we
Yeah,
have
you were here last week. Thank you so much for joining us again. We hope you can come next week too.
Yeah.
I do happen to know there's a notebook that Oscar Wilde has with notes, and I do know that the young king had a pickle concession, that there were cucumber growers also in the kingdom, and they were the sole suppliers to make the castle's pickles. That's well-known fact.
Wow. I didn't know this.
Yeah, pickles are
Bennett.
very important in fairy tales.
Hey, Bennett, you probably know this, but there is a research library just about 2 miles from 24th Street Theater on, I forget what street, I think it's on Washington, which has some of the greatest collection of Oscar Wilde manuscripts in the world.
I think that as soon as I can leave my apartment safely from COVID, that is where I will go.
I think you should. I think you
Thank
should.
you for telling me, Jay. I'm going to ask you for the address of that later.
And don't forget to pass by and say hi.
You got it,
That's right.
Shema.
That's right. Without a mask even. You're vaccinated. Brittany, what else do you have for us?
Thank you, Henry. We have David. David says, Bennett, you are a wonderful storyteller. Have you ever written any stories of your own?
David, thank you very much for asking. I have. I graduated from college in 19...
They had college back then, Bennett?
Well, when they had them. Back in the medieval era, Rome had just fallen. I don't know what happened, but I graduated college and I went home where I grew up in the state of Maine. And I got a job working at a theater that was out in the countryside. So I was surrounded by woods and fields. And something about the environment, I just started to make up fairy tales, just to entertain myself and entertain my friends. And ever since then, for about, I think it's probably about 35 years now, I've been writing my own fairy tales. I have a YouTube channel, and I plan to start recording the fairy tales that I've written on my YouTube channel. I think I've probably written about 35 now.
Wow.
You should.
Wow.
Definitely.
I'll tell you a really short one, very, very short.
Right.
Once upon a time, there was a weasel, and the weasel ate some cheese, and the cheese was magic, and he became the king of the weasels. But then he ate a strawberry, and it was poisoned, and he died. The end.
Stunning. Stunning work.
Another happy ending.
Another happy
The
end.
moral of the story
Stunning.
is, if you're a weasel, be really careful of your strawberries.
Right. But cheese, just
Cheese is
Let's
really
have
good.
another question.
no problem with the cheese.
All right, next question from Lauren Bustillo, beloved 24th Street family. In the first story, did you improvise the fourth wall breaking, or was it part of the story?
Great question.
So it's not a simple answer for this reason. I did, because it is different than this particular writing of that story. Also, Ermintrude's name is not in here, nor is Beauregard's. That was me. But the Grimm brothers in the 1600s, 400 years ago, they went around, they didn't just write these stories themselves out of their own imagination. What they did was they were what we call a curator. Like in a museum, someone who designs the museum exhibit is called a curator. They went and they collected these stories from people who work, people on farms, people in factories. And those were the people who told these stories over and over again. And their grandparents told them, and their grandparents told them. The stories are hundreds of years old. And the brothers Grimm were the first ones to write them down. So technically, I varied from their text, especially since they wrote in German. But the tradition of the story is that people tell it and people change it as they tell it, however they see fit. There are versions of Snow White that are different. She doesn't get woken up by a prince who kisses her. She gets woken up by one of the dwarfs who slaps her on the back and she coughs out the poison apple piece.
Oh,
So the
Slappy,
stories
that would be
change.
Slappy, yeah,
Yes, Slappy the dwarf, the eighth dwarf.
right,
He was on vacation in Boca Raton.
right. Great question.
So all this to say that you can tell these stories as well, and you are allowed to make things up yourself.
So you mean someone today might hear one of your stories that really were Oscar Wilde's or a Grimm Brothers story and put their own spin on it and share it with somebody else?
That's right, you can. Now, Oscar Wilde, a lot of people know who he is. He was very famous. So with his stories, I always say, this is from Oscar Wilde. And if I'm going to change it a whole lot, I'll say, this is a story originally written by Oscar Wilde, but I'm going to change it a little. Because I think it's important to respect an artist. If everyone knows who that artist is, I think it's
Right.
important to respect their work.
Right.
But if it's like the Grimm brothers Grimm, everyone, well, a lot of people know that those stories were told by hundreds of people in many different ways. So it's kind of fair to make it up yourself.
Right.
And
Exactly.
better, write your own fairy tale.
Do you have time for one more question?
Please.
All right, Brittany.
All right. So going along with that, are you planning on publishing any of the stories that you've written, your own personal fairy tales?
I don't know if you know what a bucket list is, but that's on mine. I don't know much at all about publishing and how you do it. And then there's this whole thing of, which books do they pick? But yes, that is my intention. I would love to publish these fairy tales. I have this weird feeling when I write a fairy tale that it's not me that owns the fairy tale, but that I'm just a lucky guy. The story comes from somewhere and it passes through my head and out of my mouth. Somehow that's how imagination and intuition work. And so I feel like the story has its own life. And so these stories that have come out of me, I really like, and I really want them to live in a book for other people to read years after I'm gone. Just for the sake of the stories, not because of me. I don't want to be famous. I've seen what fame can do. I'd rather have my own life, private, but I want the stories to live. So I hope that I can get them in a book someday.
I'm sure you will. We're looking forward to it. And we're looking forward to having you back here live on our stage very soon, Mr. Schneider.
Thank you, Jay, so much for having me. I always love working with the 24th Street Theater because you guys have a lot of heart and you love stories.
Thank you very much.
And we
Bennett.
love you. Give him a hand, everybody. Bennett Schneider. Hey, we are going to leave you with a little preview of next week. Our Saturday Explorer series will feature Shivani Thacker. So join us same time, same channel right here next week. We'll see you
Nos
then.
vemos la próxima semana.
Once upon a time. They connect us to our humanity, and they connect us to our community, and also to our ancestors, our history, our culture. I think my favorite aspect of stories, though, is the journey, that there's always this journey, and I think when we see characters and stories and we see the ups and downs that they go through, it reminds us that we will get through phases.